every day you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. From a sports performance point of view, what are your like big rocks or things you're trying to look at when you start thinking about a program?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with the general, and I think the cool thing is it's probably gonna sound a lot like what Dan has already said, but maybe just one step beyond. And what I mean by that is, like Dan said, I think number one is you got to do a needs analysis, right? You got to figure out what is it that the athlete needs for the demands of their life, their sport, whatever it is. I think where the two lanes for PT and strength conditioning separate is you guys are probably focused a lot more on bringing the athlete back to their normal, right? Whatever that means. Whereas our goal probably is the supranormal, meaning let's get them better at everything within the demands of their sport, better than they are right now and better than they've ever been. So, everything from a capacity standpoint to strength, mobility, stability, strength, power, change direction, like all these qualities that we want to try to improve within an athlete, we're probably trying to take them to the next level or, better than they've ever been versus you guys are trying to bring them back to being able to do that stuff in general.
Sure. That makes sense. Jonah, what do you think?
Yeah, everything Dewey said spot on. I think two of the biggest differences I kind of see is in terms of timelines, and then in terms of like guardrails that we have up. So in terms of timelines, ours is kind of infinite. If we're working with a kid who's 14 years old and eventually they're hoping that they might play a college sport or anything like that, we can think in like 4, 5, 6, 7 year timelines to a degree. So we don't want to rush that process. We don't want to get to our end level within 6 months, because where do we go from there? Then are they just doing the same thing over and over and over again? Whereas for you guys, if you're working with an ACL, you probably have a 8 or so whatever month timeline where that's the end, and hopefully you never have to work with them again because they're doing really well at that point. And then the other piece I think is with like the guardrails, where like you were talking about, Dave, you're limited by the tissues you're trying to work on. Whereas we don't really have those limits. So I think it's important for us to put those limits up for ourselves. We could have again, a 15-year-old kid who's never really lifted before, and we could start with clean and jerks if we really wanted to. Would that be a good idea? Probably not. There's probably some really base level places to start that are going to be a much better option. But we have to kind of identify those for ourselves. Whereas as long as you know that pathology that the patient you're working with is coming from, I imagine a lot of those guardrails are kind of put in place for you.
I'll do you one better. We'll talk patterns and planes.
Oh!
Bonus. No, but this is, I do think this is one of those things that's missed on for a lot of younger professionals. Because I feel like I seem to be having this conversation with our interns and PT students all the time. Like every new batch that we have, this ends up becoming a focus point. But for the lower body, our major movement patterns, if we can classify it well, would be a bilateral squat, right? So 2 feet together, moving straight up and down. That means hips go down primarily. A bilateral hinge, which is going to be 2 feet together. Hips are moving back more than they are going down. Our next pattern is going to be a lunge or a split pelvis, where one leg is out in front, the other leg is out in the back. Now, in the split pelvis, you can do either a knee dominant, where it's a little bit more like a lunge, or you can do a little bit more like an RDL or a hinge, like a stagger stance, deadlift or an RDL, where the hips are translating back a little bit more, right? So as you guys can imagine, we're kind of talking planes already of vertical versus horizontal movement. And then from there, we have our true single leg, whether it's a hinge or a squat. So like a single leg RDL, where one leg is on the ground, the other leg is completely unsupported. So we don't have that split pelvis. It's just a complete one leg movement. We have one leg hinge where the hips are moving back and forward. And then we have a one leg squat where the hips are moving straight up and down, and the other leg is unsupported. So if you guys can kind of imagine planes in this scenario, if we are bilateral, meaning both feet are side to side and on the ground, we don't have a whole lot of a requirement for side to side stability or rotational stability or competency, right? So this in nature is a little bit more what we call sagittal plane movement, where things are a little bit more up and down and forward and back if we're talking about a hinge. Whereas as soon as we go to a split pelvis position, where one leg is more of a support and it's not producing the force, we actually have to have competency to be able to not let our body completely flip over to one side or rotate and twist with whatever amount of weight that we have. So we're going to have a little bit more competency within the frontal plane, which is our side-to-side motions. and transverse plane, which is our rotational plane of motion. So now if you can imagine, if we now get rid of even that little bit of support or balance leg from the split pelvis movement, and we go into true single leg, we have way more of a demand for side-to-side stability and rotational stability and control. So this is where we're going to see the highest demand of stability frontal plane and transverse plane. Now, a little bit of the trade-off here is going to be, when do you use what? Our bilateral movements, meaning we have the most amount of stability into the ground, we're going to use to help our athletes produce the most amount of force, right? Or be challenged with the most amount of weight so they can get better at producing force. Whereas a true single leg movement, which we talked about, has the least amount of stability, we're probably not going to be able to load that up as much as our bilateral exercises, right? And, for those of you that have maybe heard the debate of what's better, single leg movements or two-legged movements. And, if anyone's listened to our podcast with Mike's podcast, our answer is always going to be do both. But we got to know the reasons of why we do both. So bilateral for more strength gain, unilateral or split pelvis for a little bit more motor control or stability gain.
And this graph, this infographic isn't completely fair for all pathologies, right? So you have, like, let's say glute medius tendinopathy that behaves a little bit differently than a femoral acetabular impingement syndrome, right? So even based on that, it's going to vary somewhat. But generally speaking, on the far left of this graph, you have a back squat, more of a low bar back squat, right? And on the far right, you're going over towards more goblet squat where you're much more upright. So if you think about common hip pathologies, and FAI and glute medius tendinopathy would fall into this, the more hip flexion you fall into, the more stress goes onto the hip in the injured area. So like an FAI, the more flexion you get, the more compression is in the front part of the hip. So if you're doing a barbell back squat, as you get to the bottom part of the squat and you're really aggressively sending those hips back, there's a lot of hip flexion, okay? And if you start going more towards the right, let's say you have a goblet squat, and if you look at the torso angle, it's upright, there's a little less hip flexion. So you're decreasing the amount of stress from that perspective, right? The other thing to think about, and I have some lines, I have some other good graphs, this one doesn't have it, but it's a little complicated to understand. The more you send the hips back in a given squat, the longer the moment arm grows and the more challenge you're now placing on the hip, right? So if you do a barbell back squat, you are increasing the amount of hip flexion, which is going to be a little tougher for someone that has, let's say, FAI or glute medius tendinopathy, right? You're also putting more load on those structures. So now they have to be able to handle more as well. So it's going to make the hip musculature just have to work harder. If you compare that to like a goblet squat or a split squat on the far right, you're very, very upright. The knee is driven forward more so. The knee is helping out more, right? So you're putting the knee in a good position to produce force, the hip in a not so good position to produce force. You're still making the movement challenging by adding load, but you're trading some of that stress off. I love the saying, I don't know if anyone uses this anymore, and I probably need to get a better saying, but robbing Peter to pay Paul. I think that's biblical or something, but basically you're trading the stress off, right? You're taking the stress from one area and just throwing it somewhere else, which is kind of nice because we still want a hard exercise that's challenging. It's just that for the particular injury, we're able to dose stress more appropriately. So if you have someone, kind of going back to our original example with, let's say, some sort of ACL reconstruction, right? Maybe it's a patellar graft, just to make it a little bit more simple. Early on in the rehab, maybe you start with a bilateral load where you're sending the hips back more so, kind of like a back squat pattern. And as you start to get a little bit further along in rehab and you want to increase some of the stress on the patellar tendon, and then you can tolerate a little more stress on that graft, you might creep over more towards a front squat as you add more load over the course of time. So you can very easily dose up the stress or dose down the stress. And this is obviously important from post-op perspective, but it's really important for any injury. I think for any injury, learning how to dose exercise is incredibly important, and it's not that complicated. I think we do a really good job of rehabbing our patients better if we just understand a couple of these principles.
Say we're taking a split squat, for example, we can shorten up the range of motion, or we can change the loading position, kind of like what Dan was talking about, where we could go goblet, we could go 2 dumbbells, we could go a barbell on somebody's back. We can change the tempo, so we can go slower eccentrics, we can do iso holds. I'd say those are kind of the main variables within any one exercise, on top of the stuff Dan talked about as well, in terms of like how much forward lean you have, can impact just for your split pelvis position stuff, whether it's more hip or knee dominant as well. So a couple different ways in which we would use that. One is kind of as a learning tool. So as somebody's newer to the gym, I like to kind of start them out with almost more naturally challenging positions. So like a goblet or a unilateral dumbbell, regardless of which hand, which is going to make it a less stable environment, which is going to cause them to slow down a little bit and really take their time to learn the exercise. Once we have the fundamentals of the exercise down, now we want to start adding load to it. So now we can start going with 2 dumbbells, something that's naturally a little more stable, like what Dewey was talking about earlier, so that we can start to push the load and really build the strength. So early on, we're trying to build the movement pattern. We want to challenge the stability a little bit, make them get comfortable. Then we want to let them load it up. Then from there, we can also start to add in speed as different variables. So whether it's tempos, again, to slow them down, almost add more metabolic stress to it. So slow eccentrics, more time under tension, going to help with hypertrophy. Whereas on the flip side, we can start to add speed to the movement to really try to enhance the neurological adaptations we're getting. So once the athletes gain the movement pattern, they've gained some good strength with it, they've started to develop some good hypertrophy, and their strength levels are pretty good, and we want to start transitioning more to the power side, we'll start to get them to do those exact same movements, but moving as fast as they can, or finding kind of a moderate load where they're moving relatively fast. So we can transition from more of like the metabolic stress to more mechanical stress by adding load to more neurological stress by adding some speed to that movement.